meeting lucky number 3. Just so you all know, and in case some of you are joining us for the first time, first I will just say we have 2 rooms in Zoom. So we have a room with presenters and the Charter Review Committee in it, and then we have another room for attendees. So it just helps us to control the presentation a little bit. So there are more people in the other room listening. And also just as another disclaimer, we are recording this presentation. So just watch what you say. First, we'll just make sure you all got the public comments that we sent you a little while ago. Actually, we haven't received too many new public comments, obviously because the presidential election takes a bit more attention away from this process. And for the folks who are joining us for the first time, go over the timeline overview just really briefly. And then we'll actually go to have a brief staff debrief from the presidential election from Elections Director Bucaro. We thought that because this is the first meeting after the presidential election, and because the topic is whether to move to November, you all would be interested in a few of the high-level numbers about what we saw in November, at least during an even year. And then we'll go into a staff presentation about November considerations. So as some of you can imagine, moving to November sounds really simple, but it's actually quite a complex process, and it would bring with it a lot of issues that we would have to evaluate. So I always kind of think of the cartoon where someone's trying to plug the hole in the dam, and then they do that once, and then there's 10 more that all of a sudden pop up that they have to try and tackle. So that's what we're going to try and just raise to you and help you guys issue spot a little bit in case you want to propose this or recommend this option to us. And then we're joined by a couple special guests today too. We have presentations by Karen Goldman, who is with the Colorado Municipal League and who has been in the Aurora Clerk's office and Lakewood as well, I believe. And also Town Clerk Lisa Anderson from the town of Castle Rock. Or I should say Castle Rock has moved recently to November in the past few years, and she'll walk you through what it's been like for them and what they've seen. And then we'll have the question and answer period and some committee member discussion if you would like, and we'll preview the next meeting. As always, just a few reminders. I've consolidated these down so we don't spend too much time. Only committee members are in this room where you can ask questions. All other attendees are muted. All meetings are recorded and added to the committee's webpage. So we have a webpage specifically for this. If you ever want to watch this presentation again, you can. And all comments emailed to the email that we've set up for this process will be collected by clerk staff and then sent to the committee. So everything that we ever get will go directly to the committee. And we just ask that you please place yourself on mute if you are not speaking. Personally, I will say, because I'm speaking for a good portion of this, I will apologize if you hear baby gibberish or a dog barking. Next, I just want to give you a reminder about the resource library. So actually, Andy Sakaris, who's on our staff, has done a really good job of combing over helpful resources that we think you may want to view or read as you weigh this decision. So we've set up this little library on the webpage. It's available both to you and any member of the public if they want to educate themselves as well. You'll see this icon, this little resource library button off to the side, and you can just click on that and it'll take you right to the spreadsheet that we have everything listed. Just as a reminder for anyone who might be joining us for the first time, the goal of this committee is to recommend a path forward for our municipal elections here in Denver. This is not something that we wanted just the clerk's office to come up and say, this is the solution to our problem, and we are going to ask you to put this on the ballot. We want this to be a very collaborative process, a process where a lot of stakeholders are here together in the room and can think through our issues before we go forward with a solution. And there's a certain set of solutions that we've put in front of the committee for them to possibly recommend to us. The first is to pursue plurality or first past the post voting. The second is to pursue ranked choice voting. The third, approval. The fourth is to simply, and the most narrowly tailored option, I guess, is to just simply give us more time in between the 2 options because we have this timeline problem. And the 5th bullet, or the 5th option, is actually what we're going to be talking about today, which is whether to change the date of the election to November. And what you'll see is why we're doing this before we hit things like ranked choice and approval. Moving to November actually touches a lot of the other bullets. and implicates some of the other bullets. So we wanted to do that first. And then the whole goal here, once we have a recommendation and a path forward, is to put something in front of voters in November of 2021. So where have we been? We have had 2 meetings so far, and then we took a break for the presidential election. The first meeting that we had, which is available on our website if you would like to see the recording, just framed the issue. We really outlined the problems that, not problems, but the timeline problems that we incurred in 2019 and that we really do not want to have to go through again, and set up why we have this committee together and what we hope the outcome can be in the timeline as well. Meeting number 2 was a really great presentation by our friend Tammy Patrick from Washington, D.C. She is the election mail guru, and she really gave a very great presentation about what it means to tie an election to the post office, what it means to conduct mail ballot elections, and the time that it takes to do that, because it does take a lot more time, which is why we have this timeline issue. Which brings us to meeting 3. We are going to be talking about whether to move our municipal elections to November and all of the issues that come along with that, and the experiences of other municipalities in Colorado who have maybe done this before us, and if there are some lessons learned there. All right. Before that though, I am actually going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to kick this over to Elections Director Bucaro. She is going to walk you through some data and some really great things from the 2020 presidential election and all of the good work that our election staff performed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction, both to the meeting and for me. I appreciate it. As Dan mentioned, I am going to just share with you all a very quick summary. I'll just take maybe 5 to 7 minutes to do a quick summary of the November 2020 election and relate it as much as I can to the work of this Charter Review Committee. So we had a very, very successful election. It was the 3rd of 2020 that we conducted, and the 2nd that we conducted during the public health pandemic. Although technically, I suppose one could say that the March presidential primary was also conducted during the pandemic, just pre shutdown and the world that we've lived in since late March. But having said that, I'd like to say that it was such a huge success in part because we had almost 1,200 election judges working in the November election, both in our ballot processing rooms as well as at our in-person voting sites. And of course, all of our team members in the elections division and the additional team members who assisted us through the clerk and recorder's office. And out of all of those people, in addition to the nearly 400,000 voters who participated in the election, I am not aware of any COVID positive case that can be related to or tied to in any way any election judge or any interaction with the voting process. So to me, that is a victory in and of itself, in addition to the fact that we had such high turnout, such huge participation, and all, relatively speaking, a very smooth election, both for voters, for our workers, and in terms of reporting results and providing information to the public, all very successful. So having said that, I'll just quickly do an overview of the election, and I'm going to start with just the electorate. This picture here, let's see if I can make it look a little bigger. Actually, hopefully you can still see my screen. This is actually data that's available on the denvervotes.org website under data and maps. This is pulled from our registration data if you'd like to dive into some of this, but this particular graph that I'm sharing with you right now shows our registration by election history. So going back to the 2018 primary election, this gives you some indication of the growth in the electorate in Denver over the last 2 years. So in the June primary in 2018, we had a total of 394,000 active registered voters. In the November general election in 2018, that number grew to 420,000 active registered voters. In this November election, that number grew to over 460,000 active registered voters. We stayed around the 420,000 mark between the November 2018 election and through the June primary election this year. And then we grew by nearly 40,000 active registered voters between June and November. So this is on track, certainly with what we've seen in past presidential election years, when between the November 2014 general election in Denver and the November 2016 general election, we actually added 50,000 active registered voters. So this time it was approximately a 40,000 active registered voter gain. But it certainly helps to illustrate how the city and county of Denver has grown, even just over the last 2 years, and how that growth is reflected in a high profile election in the increase in the number of registered voters. And I think it also helps make the case for us as to why the work of this committee is so important and why we really need to address some of the conflicting timelines and difficulty of administering a municipal election and a runoff election so close together in the future, given the amount of growth we've seen. So that's an interesting data point that I wanted to share with you all. And then these are some high level numbers for you to take away. The first 76% number refers to the number of mail ballots or ballots in general that were cast before November 1st. So before election week, 76% of the voters who voted in the election had already cast their ballot, both in person and by mail. That is a record high number of early ballots cast for Denver voters since we moved to this voting model. And it was certainly a huge benefit to us from an administrative standpoint, particularly given the fact that we had a very long ballot in Denver with 3 full 18-inch ballot cards. And that's why I put that 1.2 million number on this, because that is the number of cards that we actually tabulated in the elections division. Given the fact that we were almost at 400,000 ballots cast, that translated to almost 1.2 million cards that we actually tabulated. And then 6% is the amount of voters who participated in the election and voted in person. So that was also a lower number for a general election than what we've seen in 2018 and 2016, when we had 8 and 9% of voters voting in person. This was a huge advantage as well, because it helped keep wait times low at our in-person voting sites, as well as protected voters and our election workers during this pandemic. So we were very happy as well to see that the in-person turnout was as low as it was. If you want to look at detailed information about the return data and see breakdowns between in-person voting and where people voted, mail ballot voting and where people dropped ballots off, as well as the distribution by date and by party, you can go to the Denver Votes website. There's a button right from the homepage called Return Data, and it will take you to this dashboard, and you can look at various tabs and dive really deep into the data. Some of it is you can even download and put into your own spreadsheet and filter and look at whatever data you'd like to look at in greater detail for this November election. We have a similar dashboard available for elections going back to June of 2018 as well on the website under data and maps. That would be under our return data archive. So if you want to really dive deep into return data and see how this election compared to past elections in Denver, I would encourage you to do that through the Denver Votes website. Another interesting data point is to look at the turnout by age group. So our largest registered voter group, as far as an age breakdown, is the 25 to 34 group. And you can see that under the registration data on our website as well. We presented information on our return data by age. And this graph here takes that data and compares it to our registered voter data and illustrates how turnout broke down by age group. And you'll see, not surprisingly, that older voters tended to vote in larger percentages and in greater proportion. But it's pretty exciting to see that 75% of active registered voters ages 18 to 24 voted in November, and 85% of active voters aged 25 to 34 participated. And that really drove that high turnout that we saw in November with young people, because they do make up the largest proportion of voters in the city and county of Denver. Another interesting data point that you can't necessarily see through the data on the website is rejection data. We saw a slight increase in the number of signature discrepant ballots in November. And that is in part because with automatic voter registration in Colorado now, if a voter's registration record does not have a signature already included in it, then when they vote in the election, their ballot will automatically be marked as signature discrepant, and they will have to provide a cure. And they can cure that by signing an affidavit stating that they did indeed vote that ballot, and then including a photocopy of an acceptable form of ID. It could be a Colorado driver's license, state ID card, a utility bill, passport, or various other forms of acceptable identification. Once they've cured and provided us with that signature, then we'll obviously have a signature in their voter record. And in the future, they would not be flagged as signature discrepant simply for that reason. So that's a good thing. But that did lead to an increase in the number of signature discrepant ballots cast in the November election. So, but the other positive that we saw in this election was that voters cured their ballots at a much higher percentage than we've seen in the past. We had nearly 50% of ballots that were initially rejected but could be cured were in fact cured. So, and that is a 30% jump from the 2018 general election, when only about 30% of ballots that were initially rejected were ultimately cured. So that was a huge increase, and we were happy to see that. Not surprisingly, ballots that were rejected tended to be cast by younger voters. So you'll see that 68% of the ballots that were ultimately rejected and were not cured were actually cast by voters under the age of 35. The vast majority of these voters have limited voting history. They may be new registrants and might fall into that category where we didn't have a signature in their voter record, which meant that they were automatically signature discrepant. Or because they haven't voted as often, we may not have as many signatures to compare against when they cast their ballot. They might be newer to Colorado and therefore ID required, and may not have provided ID or the correct type of ID. So these are all just various reasons that contribute to rejections being disproportionately affecting younger voters. And the data does reflect that. So that's a brief overview of the November election for you all. I'm happy to take any questions through the comments or chat, or if you have questions after the other presentations, I will be around to answer those. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Dan.
Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can get this.
Jocelyn, in the interim, how many vote centers were there? We have a question.
We have opened 36 vote centers across the city by November 2nd. So we opened them in 4 phases, but ultimately on Monday and Tuesday, the last 2 days of voting, we had a total of 36.
Thank you.
Okay.
Could I add a comment, Dan? I want to reiterate what I said in the other meeting earlier this week with some of the same folks in the room. Just want to congratulate Clerk Lopez, Dan, Andy, Alton, Jocelyn, your whole team on a really what looked like an excellent, well-run election. And I want to advocate in front of a different audience here, as I did on Tuesday, that we get out ahead and of messaging nationally and promote the Denver success story as a counter to the false narratives that are going on right now, because one of the outcomes of the national election looks to be that some legislatures in red states are going to make it more difficult to vote. They're going to pull back from our model because of the narrative that it's prone to fraud when we know it isn't. Already we see moves in Georgia to have fewer vote centers, fewer drop-off locations for their Senate runoff that's coming up. And it's just disgraceful. And I just advocate that we do anything we can to get out ahead of that narrative and tell people, just, you ought to vote. You ought to make it easier for people to vote, not harder. So thank you for letting me have the soapbox for a minute.
No problem. And thank you very much, Councilman Flynn. All right, so we're going to pivot now to the topic of the day, which is the issue of whether to move to November. And I'm going to invite Clerk Lopez to kick us off a little bit, because this really has generated out of his experience and, you know, carrying ballots and things like that and hearing from voters. So I'll invite him to kick us off here a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Jocelyn. Great work. Councilman Flynn, I appreciate your involvement. I appreciate your analysis and the accolades. You know, I have a very good team, a very good agency, works very well. But you know, at the end of the day, it's the public, right? The voting public and just Denver residents that stepped up. We had way more applications than what we can possibly fathom. We could have filled all kinds of election judge positions if we had 5,000 of them, right? So the fact of the matter is folks stepped up. And also, you know, Denver wasn't dissuaded by the misinformation that was coming out of you know, these dark spaces, and unfortunately even the White House itself. And so I think that's something that we really, you know, you really attribute to a lot of the folks around the city, right? People know how to vote in Denver, and people know and what they can expect. And I think that's one of the things. So yes, we will continue to do that. Look, folks, our foot is never off of the pedal. You know, the presidential election may be over, but we are kicking into a different gear. And, you know, with engagement, with innovation, with looking at our operations, and also things like policy as well, too. Not all elections are the same. The municipal election in Denver is quite different from a presidential or a general. And having said that, you know, the elections model is pretty well known around the country. It's shaped the state. And to be quite honest, it's kind of outlived its home in the Denver Charter. The Denver Charter has become pretty restrictive to the point where it now cannot keep up with even some of the innovations and the policy changes at the state level. That's why we're having these conversations, because there are some things that are immediate that we need to address. And now that we are looking at that, those of you who are new in this conversation, that's part of the reason why we created this, that I created this charter exploration committee, if you will, right? What are we calling it, Dan? The thing, Charter Review Committee.
CRC.
So, a CRC. So it's basically, we need to modernize our charter. It's a little hard because it requires a vote of the people. So yes, the goal is in 2021 having something that, you know, you all can help us approve, right? And be able to do this in a way that doesn't hinder innovation and how we move forward with elections. Now, speaking from somebody who runs citywide, who is now my fourth election, right? And then also who was also ran in 4 elections. I got to tell you that as far as I can remember, these municipal elections have always been in May with a runoff. And it's not, you know, before I was an elected official, that was the case when I was an organizer on the ground. And it's a little frustrating. And I could tell you, running citywide, one of the things I always heard is, oh, you're running, you're early. What are you running for? In November, right? No, in May. May, yes, the municipals are in May. Oh, yeah. And then the runoff in June. You mean another election? We have to vote again? Yes. So one, we are constrained by some times, but then that's just the general sense that I got is everybody knows that there's an election in November. Other municipalities and counties have theirs in November as well too. So it creates this kind of patchwork quilt around our state. And the one thing that's always been a problem for us is when we have patchwork quilt policies from one county to another, people tend to get confused, right? And you lose this culture of participation and awareness. So that's one of the reasons why we're having this discussion. As everything, when we have policy discussions, you know, I wish we were out in the communities. I wish we were doing this at one of the community centers or, you know, in person town hall with some pizza and refreshments and everything else like we normally do when we organize. But because we are in COVID era and we're doing this online, we're doing our best to engage the public. So those of you who have comments or questions, you know, please feel free to hit us up. Even if you have to kind of take a break from this, you could always email us and let us know your comments as well too. So that's where this comes from. Again, thank you, Dan. But yes, that is the main question today.
Thank you very much, Clerk. I appreciate it. All right. So with that said, let's kick it off into some of the nitty gritty here of the issues that we think you all will have to consider before making this recommendation if you want to take us up on this option, which is to move to November. And I actually want to, what it ties together nicely is a request from Clerk O'Malley at the end of meeting number 2, which was the question of whether this is a problem for voters or a problem for administrators. And she asked specifically about active turnout and the turnout as it compares to May and November. So what we have taken is the turnout for the last 20 years in municipal elections, what essentially boils down to 2019 to 2003. And you can see the active turnout for the municipal, the runoff, and the coordinated election for each year. And what we found actually is that it's kind of a mixed bag. So for 2 years, 2015 and 2007, November participation rates were higher in November than they were in May. And for 3 of the years, 2019, 2011, and 2003, November had a lower participation rate than the May participation rate. Now, we're not talking about, you know, grand spectrums of voter participation. If you actually look at the numbers, they're pretty similar and they're in the same ballpark. It's not like we're comparing 40, 80, but that raises the point where we actually, when we first proposed this to you, we were thinking just whether we should move to November of that same year where municipal election is, so in the odd year. When I was chatting with Karen Goldman before this, she actually raised the question of whether we would consider November even years. And I will say the active turnout for that clearly is 70, 80, 90% even sometimes. So that's a much larger issue. And I will say, aside from this mention, what we contemplate in the next slides are only odd years. There would be even more issues I think that we would have to think through for an even year. But what you see here is a mixed bag, at least within the last 20 years, even though they're all in the same ballpark. What I will say too is Lisa Stubbs from the Elections Division keeps a very nice spreadsheet that's publicly available on our website. So if you go into the web page where you can look up historical pieces of information from every election, there is a very nice Excel spreadsheet down at the bottom that you can link to or PDF to and open. And it goes all the way back to 1986. So it's a very nice comprehensive spreadsheet where I pulled this information from. And if you want to check out even more elections, I would encourage you to go there. Before moving on to the next screen, I did just want to stop and see if anyone had questions or comments about voter participation, or if we got to what Clerk O'Malley wanted as well.
Dan, I can offer one very quick comment regarding 2007, just in case the committee members are interested. That is the only year in this chart in which November coordinated election turnout was higher than the municipal election. I did look that election up to find out what might have been driving that higher turnout, and that was marijuana decriminalization, just an FYI.
And Dan, could I add
Mhm.
to what Jocelyn just said? I had done an analysis about a year or so ago, a little over a year ago on this, and I shared with you, and we need to drill down more on this data because what drives voters, if you look at the undervotes on the major candidate races, whether it's the mayor in May or the at-large school race in November, what drives the turnout is ballot issues. Believe it or not, the Initiative 300 in May of 2019 had slightly more votes than all the combined votes for mayor when Hancock was running against some pretty stiff opposition from Calderon, Jamie Gillis, and Penn Tate, and a few other minor candidates. And I think you'll find what Jocelyn said about 2007 will be true throughout, except in a presidential year, of course. But in these off-year elections, those statewide or city ballot issues really pull people in, and then you have undervotes in the candidate races.
No, I think you're absolutely right. What's on the ballot matters certainly, and whether voters are excited about what's on the ballot can be a major driver here.
Yeah, and that's consistent data that I think I know I personally see across absolutely every single statewide, nationwide, whatever it is. I mean, I think you can see voters are absolutely more motivated by issues than by candidates. So I definitely don't think that's a city issue specifically, Councilman.
Right.
I think you're totally right. But yeah, I think issues are definitely where folks are focused. So, I mean, Dan and Jocelyn, do you have any like additional thoughts around, except for that marijuana decriminalization that could have been kind of driving that reasoning? I mean, do you hear any feedback? Because I heard Clerk Lopez say earlier, you know, that he hears a lot of feedback in the community about, oh yeah, you're running in November. Do you hear any feedback or any kind of anecdotal, you know, reasoning as to why you think it may be that we see that higher turnout when there aren't necessarily issues or anything like that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the only higher turnout, you know, at least in the last 20 years of municipal election cycles, that you can see in the data, you know, as Dan pointed out, typically municipal election turnout is the highest out of the 3 elections in these years. I have not done an analysis comparing the issues on the ballot in those specific election years. It sounds like Councilman Flynn has, which is great.
Yes.
I did just look at the one outlier, which was 2007 in the coordinated election when turnout was higher, 13,000 more votes cast, and more active registration in that election as well, in the 2007 coordinated election. And the only issue really the only exciting issue that there were a number of tax issues on that ballot, but the only real issue that I think probably drove that turnout was the decriminalization issue in 2007. And, you know, I think it's a reasonable assumption that that's likely what led to the higher turnout.
Mm-hmm. I think you would see that also if you looked at the results of each particular issue, if you went to the 2007 results sheet. I'd also point out that up until I think 95, could have been 91 or 95, Denver school elections were held in a coordinated fashion with the May municipals. So the school board candidates used to be on the ballot with city elections in May. So I think it was 95, they moved to November for the first time. And so it would be interesting to go back to the 95, 91, 87 data and see, did more people vote in the school board elections when they were combined with the mayor's race than are now voting in November? Apparently in 2019, Tim O'Brien as auditor, there were more total votes in that two-way race with Tim O'Brien and Chris Nevitt than in the school board race in November. I forget who was running then, but I think drilling down on that data would show us maybe we ought to suggest to DPS that he move their elections back to May with us. Maybe that would boost their turnout.
Yeah, I think we'll have to change a state law there.
So
Hey, Dan, this is Stephanie O'Malley. Thank you for pulling this data in response to my inquiry, part of my rationale for asking the question is I just wanted to see personally if there was a dramatic drop from the municipal into the runoff space and what those percentages were. And just based on the data here, I guess the question for us is this material enough, to have us, consider moving an election, these percentage drops where there is some. So that's why I beg the question. I'll continue to look at the numbers, but just looking at this, it doesn't seem like there's a material drop. There is some drop, but arguably, is it large enough, to precipitate a decision to move an entire election to a different cycle?
Mhm. No,
Yeah,
that's
to Stephanie's point, it's each election is so unique, given what's on the ballot, that it's really hard to draw some general wisdom from it. If the goal is to increase voter participation based on the time of year, when you've got the mail ballot anyway, I mean, it's probably a pretty sketchy argument to make, really,
Yeah.
And I don't have a axe to grind one way or the other. Probably to Paul's point earlier, voters are used to November, but I don't know that Denver voters feel the same way. So I just have an open mind about it.
The other thing, and I appreciate that, the other thing that we have to remember is that these numbers don't take place in vacuums, right? And part of the intent of these meetings is also discovering what are the values that folks have in Denver, right? Turnout, access, what are the things, is it just general cultural participation, right? So those are the things that we want to discover as we have these meetings. So please let us know what you value. What do you expect when you vote in a municipal, when you vote in a presidential and a general? What are your expectations, right? What are the values that you hold so that we could actually identify those, right? If turnout is the only value, then turnout will be the only factor that we look at. But the other thing you have to consider is the fact that from 2003, I'm looking at from 2003 to today, the voting has changed dramatically, right? In 2013, you start having the all mail ballot elections. You start having improvements along the way, things to make it easier for voters, so turnout's going to increase. The other thing that we also have to keep in mind, being that these things don't happen just in a vacuum, is the way people campaign. Who's raised as much money, and this kind of really unfortunate philosophy around campaigning that look, I only have so many resources, we're going to spend it where the voters are, and ignoring the whole swaths of the city that never get that engagement, right? And so you got to really think about those variables as you look at these numbers and these comparisons, right? One of the cases in point, one of the issues was legalization of marijuana, driver to the polls.
This is Andy. I have two questions from the audience. One is, would the CRC ever consider moving municipals to every 2 years over every 4 years? And does anyone know of any data available on campaign expenses in relation between the May and November elections? And how much additional money candidates have to spend their time on raising between the election and the runoff?
Well, a lot of that information is available online now, and one of the things that we're doing is a major overhaul to the way that we gather campaign finance data, and also the way we make it public. So that's one thing that's coming down the pike, in which Dan at one point will be able to update you on, and Andy as well. The other thing is that's a good question. To be quite honest, I never considered that, and that's something that we can also take a gander at now. Know that you also don't want your representatives constantly raising money in the off season, and know that that's changed a little bit every other 2 years, right? So
Yeah, and that's something we certainly can look at. I will say school board candidates actually have to file their campaign finance reports with the state. So we'll have to do some comparison between what's filed at the municipality and or with us and what's filed at the statewide level.
Mhm. The nature of the election also makes a difference in answer to Andrew's question there. In 2015, when I was elected the first time, there was no, as you can see in the chart there, there was a much lower active registration because there were only 5 council districts where there was a runoff. Mayor Hancock ran for re-election without significant opposition. And so in the runoff, there was fundraising and campaigning only in 5 districts, including mine. And so that had the nature of the election and whether there's a citywide runoff has an influence on it. Paul, when you won last year citywide, the vote totals were almost identical to the May. In June, there was almost, I think it was only 100 vote difference out of 100 and some odd thousand. I looked it up recently.
I was having PTSD about that. Thank you for rekindling the PTSD. Thank you.
You worked it, man. The cure process.
Great. And then, yeah, I will say too, for the first part of that question, I believe about what would be staggering terms, we've said in the first meeting that the committee, the way we feel, you can recommend any charter amendment that you want to us, and we'll discuss it. So I'll leave that into the committee's purview, whether we want to tackle that one as well. Okay. Great. Well, we'll move on then to the next issue that I think moving to November would raise for all of us in Denver, which is, in short, we would have to lengthen the amount of time that we would actually fix the problem. So as you can see here, we have 4 dates and time. What we're originally thinking is that we would have this fix in place with the first 2 dots. So the question would go in front of the voters in November of 2021, and then the fix would be in place by May of 2023. By moving to November, if this is the option the committee would like to go with, we feel like we would want to give voters the option to do that, because essentially what we would have to do is extend city or elected officials' terms by about 6 months to that next November. So we actually think this would extend our timeline by another election cycle, another 4 years, where in November 2021, we would have to ask voters, hey, is it okay when you vote in May of 2023, those officials have another 6 months on their term, and then in of November of 2027, that's when we would make that switch over to November. I don't think we could actually do it in 2023. So it wouldn't be until May of 2027, this 3rd dot here, where we would actually possibly eliminate the general municipal in the runoff. So I want you all to be aware of that issue as well, that if you want to go down this path, we're extending this by another 4 years, and we would need some sort of fix still for May of 2023.
Thanks for pointing that out, Dan, because I did want to raise at some point in this discussion that if we were to move the election to November, that then we would practically be predetermining the decision as to whether we would maintain the runoff system, because no one would be wanting to have a runoff over the Christmas season.
Yeah, we're actually going to hit that in a couple slides, so
Right.
I'll illustrate that. Thank you. Okay, or the next slide, I should say, Councilman. So this brings us to really the next big issue that we have spoken about internally as staff, which is if we move to November, there is no way we can actually keep the runoff election. And this is because primarily municipal elections always occur the year before a presidential year. And a presidential year already has 3 elections under the state elections code. We have the presidential primary, the state primary in June, and then the presidential. One of the trickier aspects to this is we don't actually know when the presidential primary election is going to be held every year. Under Title I, it's actually up to the governor, and he shall pick a Tuesday no later than the 3rd Tuesday in March. Now the early window or the marker for that is with party bylaws. I have not looked up the party bylaws for this, but you can't do it before or whenever the parties say so. But in reality, we can't go past the presidential primary as the 3rd Tuesday in March. So we won't know realistically until the last half of the year before when that's going to be. To illustrate this point, I've taken the elections calendar from when we went from 2019 to 2020. And as you can see here, in the 2019 coordinated election day was on November 5th. The last day to canvass and certify the election results under Title I was on the 27th of November. But as we know, someone could always request a recount too. So the last day to request the recount is actually covered up by my little Zoom thing, December 3rd. And then the last day to complete that recount is December 12th. Now, while we were working that, the Secretary of State's office is collecting all of the affidavits of people who want to run for president. And so they're working that process already. They certified to us the presidential primary ballot content on January 3rd, 60 days before the March 3rd presidential primary. Now, obviously, this was the way it actually worked out. It could have been a worse scenario where the presidential primary was actually conducted in February, and then we have a much tighter and quite possibly even overlapping elections calendar. Or we really only buy ourselves about 2 more weeks if Governor Polis had taken the full time to let us administer the presidential primary. So at the end of the day, what we really want to just point out for you all is, if you want us to move to November, and if you think that's the path forward, we're going to have to touch one of the other things, either plurality, ranked choice voting, approval voting. We're going to have to also roll in one of those, because there's just no way to actually conduct the runoff election. Unless you want to kill our election staff, but I don't think that's the case. All right, that brings us back to just some pros and cons that we want to high level bring for you as well. The pros of this, as you heard from Director Buccaro in the first meeting, it costs us $1 million to conduct the general municipal election in 2019 and another $1 million for the runoff, for a total of $2 million. We're already going to be conducting that November election no matter what, so theoretically, this would be a $2 million save for the city. Additionally, there's always going to be that voter familiarity with the November election, as Clerk Lopez illustrated earlier. There are some cons though, and there are some pretty big cons to be from my perspective. City officials, this means they would probably take office in January, we assume, if we were maintaining the same calendar. This means a new clerk and recorder based on the current calendar would come in during a presidential primary. Clerk Lopez can attest if he wants to expand on this point, but coming in the middle of an election is probably not the best idea for a clerk and recorder, especially if that clerk and recorder is brand new. It's hard enough for the year before a presidential election, let alone coming in during the presidential primary. That would be a really big ask of that person. Additionally, we assume this would hit a lot of other city processes, and we just kind of brainstormed the budget. That was the first thing that popped into my head, if that would have to change. But we assume this would change a lot within the city too. Some we can't even think of, but it's one of those things where once we crack this open, it's gonna have a lot of effects. And then the other thing, depending on your thoughts on the situation, I assume a lot of people in Denver like the fact that when we have the municipal election in May, it's only Denver content, right? If we move to November, we would be coordinated with other entities, mainly the state. So there would be the school board candidacies, there would be the state questions. And if we chose to even coordinate with a special district that was holding on the same day, that content would always also be on the ballot. So Denver content wouldn't be the sole content on the ballot.
Dan, if I might add something to that as well too, I hate to just interrupt. But you also, in the con, part of it is, Denver, when we run our county municipal elections, right, we call the shots on a lot of stuff. And we have a little bit more latitude, right, to try new innovative things and to be able to test that out and to pilot some of that. However, when you run up into a coordinated state election, you're also beholden to a little bit more regulatory framework, right? And meaning that, for example, a pilot that was used for overseas, are folks living abroad and folks who are serving in the military, was UOCAVA ballots. We had a pilot that was 100% secure and solid, and they were able to vote through their phone, through votes. That, you know, that company and that project has since been reviewed by the EAC and has gotten some good, you know, made some good progress. We wouldn't be able to do that in a state election, right? And so thinking about some of the innovations that we could possibly use in a municipal, we wouldn't be able to do that if we coordinated with the state in November. So keep that in mind as well too. But yes, the common, you walk into the street, and I literally spend a lot of time, a lot of us in these rooms have been, you know, on the ground, knowing we've had those similar conversations, right?
I guess one question I would ask is, you know, moving to a January timeframe, that essentially locks in for that new elected, the budget's already been set. I think something that we should consider is, I don't know how realistic it is that we're going to change our city's budgeting process. It's on a calendar year. It's January through December. And so newly electeds, even if they are part of a runoff, come in mid-year, June or July. We're all sworn in July, and the budget process, you know, our council budget hearings start in September. And that's a deep dive for council members to be able to get in and influence that budget process. I mean, this year, this city council, we were able to secure a little bit over $5.2 million for our initiatives. And that happened September, October, November, us all really working together and pulling towards that. And so it just gives me a little bit of a pause, because you would essentially have a newly elected official coming in January, and then they're not going to have a bite at that budget apple basically until September, October, November of that year. And so, you know, I for myself, that gives me a little bit of pause.
You know, the other thing, I'm sorry, don't mean to.
No, go ahead.
Council President Gilmore took the point right out of my mouth. That was going to be my next comment. That's the most significant negative to moving municipals to November. And remember, some cities, not that we would do it this way necessarily, but some cities, right after the November election, those officers take office. Those new electeds take office almost immediately upon certification. I think some of the new council members elected in our suburban neighbors are in November already have taken their seats. So potentially, depending on how it's structured, new Denver council members could be seated in the midst of budget negotiations and budget adoption. Somebody who would have to vote on a final budget who had just been elected and wasn't involved from September on. So I think that's, you know, everything in the three bullets in the con list. I think you need to add that fourth one right at the top. That's the impact on our budget cycle, I think, is the biggest negative to moving to November. Thank you, Councilwoman Gilmore.
I would be curious to know what Castle Rock or other experiences have been when you've made that move.
Yeah, so that's a good segue, Clerk. Thank you very much. So that brings me, I'll skip our question slide because I think we had a really good discussion there. That brings me to introduce our first presenter, and really I'm really excited for our two presenters today. But the first presenter is Karen Goldman, and she has over 30 years of clerk experience. She's been with the city of Aurora, the city of Lakewood, I believe, and she was also secretary of the Colorado Senate. What she does right now is she works with Colorado Municipal League, CIRSA, and the Municipal Clerks Association to go throughout the state of Colorado and help municipal clerks when doing what they're doing. And so she has this great high-level experience of what's going on, because frankly, we wouldn't be the only ones. We're not the only ones contemplating this. There are a few towns and cities that make this switch every year. So without further ado, I will actually introduce Karen Goldman to speak a little bit. And Karen, I'm actually going to just stop sharing my screen.
All right.
So that you're bigger for everybody, if that's okay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I have made notes, so if I keep looking down and not at all of you, it's simply because I am paying attention to what I've written. I have two professional passions. The first one is working with local governments and municipal clerks, and the second is elections. And I am very, very delighted that I have the opportunity to continue to do both of those. So my role here today is to provide all of you with what I call kind of a historical perspective. Dan is correct that Denver's consideration of changing their election date to November is neither unprecedented nor unusual. There are many municipalities that have done that, 13 recently in the last 3 years, and I'll go through that briefly. But just first of all, let me talk about the kind of the election world outside of the city of Denver. Now, Clerk Lopez indicated that municipal elections are conducted very differently from the general elections, the coordinated elections in November. And I would venture to guess that the way Denver conducts its elections is going to be very different from the way most of the other municipalities in the state conduct their elections. So while there may not be an apples to apples comparison, I'm hoping that the things that I have to tell you today you find informative. So first of all, let me just say that in Colorado, there are statutory cities and statutory towns, and the designation, the difference between city and town, is based on the population at the time of incorporation. And a statutory city holds its regular election in November of odd numbered years, where statutory towns hold their elections in April of even numbered years. And you can imagine the challenge everybody had this year with COVID and trying to figure out how to get judges and all that. But I have to say that in some cases, voter turnout was a lot higher than it had been before. So the election dates have been in law for a long time. They predate Tabor, which was the impetus for coordinated elections. And it also, those dates predated the implementation of all mail ballot elections that are conducted by the county clerk and recorders. I will say that Title 31 elections, which are the elections that municipalities use when not coordinating with their county clerk and recorders, do not require that the elections be done by mail. Elections can still be held as polling place elections, and for some really small communities, they continue to do that because it is a lot more efficient, cost effective. Now, when the statutory cities converted to home rule, as many of them did, they maintained their November odd number year election. CML put out a report in 2016, which indicated that there were 44 home rule municipalities that had November odd year elections and 7 which had November even year elections. And that number has increased, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And of course, as a home rule municipality, they can identify whatever date they want as their election date. So, so in terms of the movement, during 6 elections conducted from April 2018 through November 2020, 13 municipalities, 5 of which were home rule, moved their election dates to November, 8 of them to even year elections and 5 to odd year elections. So what I did was, based on the list I got from the Municipal League, I contacted the municipal clerks in those municipalities and I asked them 3 questions. What was the impetus for making the change? What, if you've had an election under your new election date, what were your observed changes? Were there any distinctions, any differences? What happened? And the last question I asked was, were there any fallout? Was there any fallout, or were there any issues of concern with having to have changed that election date? So based on the responses that I got, to answer the first question, what was the impetus? Every single municipality said it was cost driven, that they had determined that the cost to coordinate, to move their election to November, was going to cost them less than if they ran the election on their own. And this is especially true for the municipalities that move their dates to odd year elections, because the costs historically tend to be less than in even numbered years. The other impetus had to do with voter turnout. One municipality which moved from April to November, indicated that their last April election, they had a 29% voter turnout. And when they moved to November, their very first election, they had a 77% voter turnout. So it was quite substantial. And for a lot of municipalities where they're seeing a lot of growth in areas, and we know that Colorado is a pretty desirable place to live. I personally, I lived in another state before I came here that was pretty desirable, but I'm gonna stick around, that's for sure. So what they've determined was, as their municipalities get bigger, their voter registration gets bigger, the number of people voting gets bigger, and that creates issues for them. They need more staff. They need maybe more sophisticated equipment to do signature verification if they're doing a mail ballot election. They need a bigger facility. And these are the kinds of things that aren't really available to them. And quite honestly, there's a lot of turnover in municipalities. There's, I believe, only 6 elected clerks in the state of Colorado. And so, not everybody's lucky to have a 4-year term of office. And the turnover is really high, and coming in and running an election without any prior knowledge isn't always easy. In terms of the changes, they did find that there was increased voter turnout. And yes, indeed, the cost of moving their elections to November were less. And then finally, in terms of fallout, other than all the national election noise that Councilmember Flynn mentioned, nobody indicated that there had been any concerns or any issues, either from the elected officials or from the citizens. And every time this went to the ballot, it was approved by the voters. So that's basically what I wanted to let you know. And I'm very happy to answer any questions should you have them.
Thank you.
Yeah, Karen, I had a question when you said that municipalities that moved from April to November went from like 20-something% turnout to 70-something. Would you have access to the data that I was referring to earlier in the meeting about what races were actually being voted? Or did 74, 77% actually vote in the municipal election?
I'll have to dig into that more,
Okay.
more, but I'm guessing that the 77% voter turnout was the figure that the county clerk provided in terms of the total
Right.
turnout. And
Okay.
from the information that I gathered, there was only candidates from this particular municipality on that ballot. So for the local election,
Okay.
it was just a candidate election.
Okay, so like in our case, I found one of the DPS board elections after they moved to November, and it might have been in the early 2000s, where there was a significant turnout, but it was because of some huge statewide issue that was on the ballot. But the vote for the at-large citywide school board member was extremely low. And so it does make a difference. I wouldn't want to move our municipals to November just to have a bigger turnout generally, but the same number of people voting in the city election, right? So that would be a good data point to have. Thanks.
What were the size of these counties as compared to Denver?
Well, of course, everybody is smaller than Denver. So these municipalities were smaller. They were statutory. Well, let me back up and say, I don't have the specific statistics in terms of population data. This is something I can get to Dan if you are interested in having it. They were all statutory city. They were all, let's see, 1, 3, 5, 9, I'm sorry, 8, 8 of the 13 were statutory cities, so they had at least a population of 2,000 and likely much more. So if you would be interested in having exact population, I'd be happy to get that to you. Okay.
Karen, if I could ask, did any of the cities that changed their election date to November encounter issues, whether it was costs or coordination or, as Clerk Lopez pointed out, limited options because of the coordinated November election that they were participating in?
I'm sorry, did they
Basically, did the coordinated election, the fact that they were engaged in the coordinated election, end up being a problem for them, either in terms of cost or limited flexibility in holding the election?
Oh no,
Right.
oh no, not at all. I think everybody who responded indicated that they were overall pleased. You know, when municipalities participate in a coordinated election, they don't give up all of their responsibilities. Everything that has to do with the ballot, identifying the candidates, dealing with the petitions, any amendments, any withdrawals, creating the ballot issue notice, if there's a Tabor issue, getting everything to the county clerk, that still remains the responsibility of the municipality. It's at the point of certifying the ballot where the county takes over in terms of printing the ballots, mailing the ballots, counting the ballots, signature verification. So there still is a lot of control that municipalities have when they move to a coordinated election. So does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks, and thanks for presenting, and it's good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Is it safe to assume that a November election would increase the length of the ballot, or is that an issue?
Well, in a November election, the ballot is always pretty long. I mean, Denver's kind of unique in that in the other counties, they work with multiple municipalities, obviously school districts, and even numbered years, the state races, the state ballot items, any local ballot items, both questions and issues that might arise. So the ballots tend to be long, and the addition of the municipality will, of course, lengthen it depending upon who does what. So even I would say even without the municipal involvement, the ballots these days will probably continue to be pretty long.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen.
And know, Alan, that there's also something else that's on the horizon, is that with the Fair Elections Fund and the implementation of the Fair Elections Fund, we can probably assume that the length of the ballot in terms of the number of candidates running for office may increase. This is something that we have yet to kind of test out and look at, but that, also just a heightened political awareness, more participation. And at the end of the day, folks, I mean, we really want to get and capture these conversations and also capture these values, as I said in the beginning. And the way we run elections is we want to make sure that our elections always remain voter friendly. And that's the key, is we want to make sure it's easier for the voter to be able to cast a ballot. And whatever possible obstacle we can remove for that, or whatever innovation that we can implement to do so, we're going to take a very serious look at. And part of that is determining what's voter centric, right? And then also in the grand picture is you want to create a culture of participation. You want it, one of my, measures of success in the future, and I say in the future, is do the elementary school students now know who the mayor is and when to vote for them? And then also knowing that they can do that one day, right? So you want to kind of start brewing that culture of participation in the city. And you know, it's a little bit confusing when you have elections that are in off years and different months. You want to create it, make it easy for voters to want to participate.
Yeah,
And
you know, on the other hand, Paul, I think because the municipal election is its own stage for a bit, everybody's kind of focused on that, right? So you're not competing with other elected officials. I guess on an off year it wouldn't happen anyway, but I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I do wonder whether the budget issue just kind of trumps this whole conversation, because that one is, as President Gilmore pointed out and as Councilman Flynn pointed out, that's a thorny one. I don't know how to unravel that unless we just want to have a rule that the mayor can control the budget for a year, right, council members?
Well, and you know, running the budget process this year, I mean, it's in charter.
Yeah, of
It's
course.
outlined in charter that we need to you know, vote by the second Tuesday in November. So I just wonder what that would look like going forward.
So I do just want to hop in because I want to be respectful of time. We have one more person. So we have, and I will begin sharing my screen again. So we have one more person with us that I think will help with this as well. And that is Town Clerk Lisa Anderson. So when we initially started thinking about this as well, we wanted to see kind of who in the metro area had done this recently, and Castle Rock popped up on our radar. Castle Rock made this change just a few years ago, and so we invited Clerk Lisa Anderson to stop by and have a nice little chat with us about what it was like in Castle Rock when they made this move. So with that, I will invite Clerk Anderson to help or present a little bit. And Clerk, I will move the slides for you. Just let me know when you want me to move the slides.
Okay, hi guys. Nice to see you again. Thank you for having me. Yes, we voted in November of 2015 to move to November coordinated elections in even numbered years. And that has turned out to be very beneficial. And I guess because one of the main motivators was for voter engagement and voter turnout, which we saw a substantial increase in voter turnout. I can't see the screen because I've got the people video over the screen part of it. So I apologize if I don't have those percentages correctly on the voter turnout, but normally our voter turnout was between 20 and 30%. I think our highest turnout was something like 43%, and that was on a really contested item. It was on legalizing retail marijuana in Castle Rock, and the other one that we had a high turnout for was on the open carry Second Amendment issue. Both of those were really high profile items, but yet our voter turnout was still only about 40%. When we switched over to coordinated November elections, our turnout went up to the high 70s. And then this year's presidential election was 91%. A lot of that was because that election was so near and dear to so many people's hearts that we did have quite a large turnout for that, just because of that, I think. But if your main motivation is voter turnout, you definitely are going to have a higher turnout going to a November election, whether it's odd numbered years or even numbered years, just because you're going to have other issues contained on that ballot that are going to draw voters to want to vote in that election. The other benefit, I don't know if this is a this is a benefit maybe to candidates, is that with the higher turnout, recall signatures, they're going to be required to have a lot more recall signatures on those petitions because you do have higher voter turnout. So sometimes candidates do like the benefit of that as well. Go to the next slide if you could. So we did do our own election code. We incorporated that in 2015 as well. And that does give you a lot more flexibility for making your own decisions of your nomination petitions, the number of nomination signatures that you need, deadlines for write-in candidates, contribution limits, and who can contribute and who can't, and what those limitations are. Also, if you want to impose more violations and penalties for filing of the FCPA reports. So those are kind of the benefits of your own election code, which I believe Denver has your own election code. Is that correct? Oh,
Well,
I think you're, okay.
Yeah, we say we follow Title I, but then we carve out a lot of exceptions. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. So, and I did want to speak to the budget issue because we have the same deadlines for the budget, that it has to be, approved by a certain time, presented for introduction to council in October, and that it has to be filed with DOLA by I think December 15th. So we have all of those same requirements. I guess what we do is we start our budget process a little earlier as far as presenting it to council. So we kind of moved all of those up a little bit. We start in August by presenting and introducing it, and then the ordinances to approve it. We have that all wrapped up before the election. So we have the current council members still making all those decisions and have all of that knowledge and experience to contribute to those decisions on the budget, and just take care of it before the election, so we don't have to worry about a new council coming and getting, thrown into a budget process. So that could be a consideration for you all as well, just moving that up a little bit. And the next slide, if you could. So what we also notice is just obviously the staff time is a big time saver as well, because you're not using your staff to do an April or a May election and then also a November election, because a lot of times you will have items that you want to put on a November ballot anyways, if you're going to coordinate with the county in November, if you've got a taper issue or whatever. So just not having that duplicity of efforts. And when you coordinate with the county is what we've discovered is, and which it might be different for Denver. I don't know if you'd be coordinating or just running your own election in November.
Mm-hmm.
But it does save considerable amount of time and duplicity of efforts and duplicity of financial considerations when you can coordinate those efforts. And just, again, the voters are already kind of fine-tuned into knowing November election. So the participation is going to be higher. Maybe the voter education is going to be higher because they've got one time of the year that they're focusing on those issues and really studying up and learning what those ballot issues are. There's a lot more publicity about ballot issues. So you find that maybe voters are a little bit more educated on what they're voting for as well. And go ahead in the next slide. So this is what we found with the costs when we coordinated the election. There really wasn't a big difference in the costs. When you have control over your own election costs, you know how to kind of cut corners a little bit and maybe not spend as much money as you need to. But we really didn't see a big difference in our election costs. This year's election was a lot lower than it was last year, and that's because we didn't have any other ballot issues. All we had were candidates. So I think that's a lot of the reason why it was definitely much less. And our numbers for elections seem so tiny compared to Denver's that it seems a little irrelevant. But I think just on a ratio scale that you'll see that maybe the cost isn't the big motivator, but the staff time and most importantly, the voter engagement and the voter turnout is a huge motivator. At least it was for us. And we saw that in spades as far as how much that did increase, which is what you want. That's why we do elections, is we want our people to be engaged and to be participating in our government and making those decisions. So I don't know if there's another slide or not, Dan. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I believe this is the last one. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely higher voter turnout, less staff time. The cost, not really a big difference with us, but and then the benefits of your own election code, which you guys already have, and you have the ability to make those changes to get a little more control over how you want your nomination process and your financial filing process to go is always good to have. So that is all that I have. Are there any questions anyone has?
Sure. Lisa, this is Councilman Flynn.
Yes.
In Castle Rock, do you have a council manager form of government?
Yes, we do.
So your mayor is a member of the council?
Yes, and he
Okay.
has the same voting rights and the same power. It's more ceremonial,
Right.
and he has,
Okay.
you know, yeah, I understand.
Is your mayor elected as mayor, or is it selected by the members of the council?
We just changed that actually 2 years ago. We had it on our ballot to change our charter to allow at large to be elected, and so he is elected at large.
Okay.
that-
So when you
that
had
was-
election, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. When you had elections in April, was it?
Yes.
Okay. When did the newly electeds take office after that?
I believe at that time they took, I think they came, oh, I can look that up. It
Okay.
might have been the very next council meeting after the election or the following month, but
Oh, okay.
pretty quick,
So
quick.
immediately after certification of the results, I imagine. Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
And now that they're elected in November, when do they take office? Did they wait till January, or do they come in again
Nope.
shortly after?
They take office the first meeting in December. So it's about a month between when they're elected and when they're sworn in. And
Okay, so
that
this
gives us enough time for the
Okay,
certification.
So this gets to the heart of my question. I'm trying to speak quickly, because I know we're coming up on time.
Sure.
Your budget season starts in August, I heard you say.
Yeah, that's when we start introducing the budget.
So when is the
not-
final vote at council? When is the final vote on it?
The final vote is usually, I'm trying to remember what council meeting it was. I think it was either the first or the second meeting in October. We get that taken care of. So it's
Okay.
before the election.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Any more questions for Clerk Anderson? All right. Well, Clerk Anderson, thank you very much. And I will say thank you very much to Karen Goldman as well. I greatly appreciate you guys being willing to help us out and to speak today. I greatly appreciate it.
Anytime. Good luck, you guys.
Thank you. All right. So that is what we have for the presentation today, and we are pretty close to time. So I will say, for those of you listening in, we are always taking public comment 24/7 at charterclerk@denvergov.org. And we will pass every single comment that we get into that email inbox onto the committee members so that they have what you want them to hear. Just so you guys know, for the original schedule that we had for this, there are actually 2 meetings in January. So now that the presidential is done, we've got a good rhythm that we're going to hit. And the next meeting is going to be January 7th. One of the questions I do have for you all, though, is we moved this to 2:30 instead of 1 o'clock. I just wanted to make sure this is a good time for you. If it works for everybody, we'll keep it going forward. I think we did pretty well with it, but just let us know in the meantime, and we'll make any adjustments if necessary. But the next meeting's topic is going to be ranked choice voting. So it's another pretty heady presentation and topic that we're going to be discussing. We'll hear from RCV for Colorado, who advocates for ranked choice voting and for municipalities to adopt it. And then we also have a speaker logging in from Zoom, from the city of Minneapolis, who's going to give their perspective about what it looks like to actually administer ranked choice voting as a municipality, and a city around the same size as Denver. So we'll have a really good administrator's perspective from her. And then we'll, have the same discussion. And one of the other things we will have teed up for you in January 7th as well is the future engagement in town halls that we'll want to do around this. Clearly, any path forward is going to be a change to our voters. And so we want to make sure that we're all comfortable. This is going to have to be communicated. We're going to have to go out there and engage the community and say, this is, the timeline problem we've been hitting, and this is our proposed solution. And what do you think? So we'll have some ideas and questions for you around that as well in January. All right. Does anyone have any questions or concerns before we wrap up before 4?
Yeah, Dan, on the bulleted list at the beginning, and again on here and discussing the upcoming meetings, I don't see a carve out to discuss specifically on modifying the system we have now to extend the calendar. When will we do that?
So we'll probably do that in the 6th. Really couldn't think of a way to extend that for 90 minutes. Like this discussion was. So we'll actually capture that in the 6th meeting. And then we're also going to hit just the idea of plurality voting. The speaker that dropped out in meeting number 2, if you remember, he was going to hit on that topic. So we're going to bring that in on the 6th meeting as well. And that will be in early February or somewhere in time in February. I don't remember exactly when.
All right, thanks.
And Dan, I did put in the chat a question about other larger counties. Have they considered moving their elections to November? So Jeffco, El Paso, Larimer, some of the larger ones.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in knowing the answer to that.
Yeah, we can certainly do the research. I didn't do that research before this meeting, but I'll certainly take a crack at that and we can send that out to the group. Yeah.
And Clerk O'Malley, I think one of the things that we looked at is also some other sizable cities like Denver, right, around the country. A couple of which, we took a gander at, were a little different because so when partisan primaries, right? A little different in terms of how they do it. They tend to kind of make those shifts throughout the year to kind of pair up with their November election. However, what we want to be able to do is apples to apples, right? And so I think that's exactly what we want to continue to do, is see if there are those discussions that are happening out there with some of those sizable Denver-like cities and counties.
Yeah, that's a good point. Clerk, statutory counties will go through the primary process because those are partisan elections, and then they'll be in November. Yeah.
No public comment, questions? Anything in the queue that we haven't addressed or that we need to address?
I don't think so. All right, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate all of your time as always, and we will be in email communication with you in between now and January 7th, and have happy holidays, stay safe, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dan, for leading us through.
Thank you.